I want you to picture the port of Surat. It's on the western coast of India.
Right. And we're talking August of 1695.
Exactly, August 1695. And the monsoon season is just, it's heavily suffocating the air. It's thick, oppressive, smelling of salt and damp earth and wood smoke.
Right?
And slowly limping into the harbor is a ship.
Well, barely a ship.
Right. I mean, it barely looks like a ship anymore. This is a 1,600-ton Mughal behemoth called the Ganj-i-Sawai. But I don't want you to picture a proud galleon returning from this lucrative voyage. I want you to picture a floating crime scene.
Yeah, the visual is just profoundly disturbing. The mainmast of this massive vessel is violently shattered. Like the splintered wood is jetting into the sky like a broken bone.
My God.
The decks are scorched black from powder burns. The heavy canvas sails are just, hanging in these shredded ribbons. And the sound, there's no triumphant horn, no bustling crew throwing mooring lines.
Yeah.
There are only these eerie, hollow echoes of traumatized survivors crying out from the darkness of the lower decks. It is the aftermath of an absolute nightmare.
Imagine the profound vulnerability of being thousands of miles from land in the late 17th century. You were suspended in an environment where literally no one can hear your cries.
Where the line between the law and absolute unmitigated savagery just vanishes.
Exactly. The ocean strips away all the safety nets of civilization. And these passengers, they were trapped in the middle of that dark water with a monster.
It is a visceral, terrifying reality, and we have to start with that blood-soaked deck, because the events that led to that shattered ship drifting into Surat, they literally altered international law.
Yeah, they really did.
They birthed the first worldwide manhunt in human history. The architect of this maritime horror story didn't just attack a ship, he essentially declared war on the entire global economy of the 17th century.
And we are, of course, talking about Henry Every, the Pirate King, sometimes recorded as Henry Ivory or Long Ben. For this deep dive, we're taking our stack of sources. The naval records, the harrowing survivor accounts from contemporary historians, the trial transcripts, and even some brand new modern archaeological findings.
Which are fascinating, by the way.
Unbelievable, really. And we are looking at this through the lens of a true crime horror story. Because there are no parrots on shoulders here, no jolly sea shanties.
No, not at all.
We are going to reconstruct the anatomy of a mutiny, the mechanics of the most lucrative heist in human history, the claustrophobic paranoia of the global manhunt that followed, and ultimately, the eerie, phantom-like disappearance of a man who pulled off the crime of the millennium and just evaporated.
It's chilling,
Yeah.
because to comprehend how this unprecedented nightmare unfolded, we really must understand the pressure cooker that forged Henry Every.
Right.
Men capable of this level of calculated violence and manipulation, they don't just emerge fully formed from the foam of the sea. They are the product of very specific, desperate systems.
So if we want to understand the predator that fell upon the Ganj-i-Sawai, we have to rewind from the bloody aftermath in India back to a rotting wooden prison in a Spanish port.
Yeah. So the historical records place Every's birth around 1659 near Plymouth, England. He enters the Royal Navy during the 9 Years' War.
And let's establish the geopolitical landscape here, because it's crucial for the listener to understand. The 9 Years' War was this massive global conflict, primarily between France and a European coalition.
Right.
And it acts as an absolute vacuum for maritime law enforcement. The navies are all busy fighting each other, which means the vast stretches of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans are essentially unpoliced.
Which creates a sprawling shadow economy. And the Royal Navy of the late 17th century was a brutal proving ground in its own right. The conditions were horrific.
Rampant disease spreading through cramped, poorly ventilated lower decks.
Yeah, rancid provisions. And officers who maintained discipline through the lash, Every served as a midshipman, actually participating in major conflicts like the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690.
So he sees real combat.
He does. He learned advanced navigation, the geometry of naval combat, and crucially, he learned how to process absolute chaos. He watched men break under the terror of cannon fire, and he learned how to stay cold and completely detached.
And he leaves the Navy in 1690, and here is where we get our first look into his psychology. Because he enters the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah, this is a dark turn.
Very. The sources detail a specific method he used that is just deeply sinister. He wasn't just transporting enslaved people, he was actively practicing a form of psychological terror to acquire them.
The accounts from rival slave traders like Captain Thomas Phillips, they note that Every was unusually devious, even within an industry that is defined entirely by profound cruelty.
Right, which is a lot.
It really does. Every would sail along the Guinea coast flying friendly colors. He'd invite local African chieftains or even other slave traders aboard his ship under the guise of legitimate diplomacy or trade.
And then once they're on board, sitting in his cabin, feeling entirely safe and secure, he springs the trap.
Exactly. He'd strip them of their wealth and chain them in the dark hold alongside the very people they had just been trading.
He weaponizes human trust. He creates a false sense of security, entirely bypassing the need for a physical battle. He manipulates the environment so his victims willingly walk right into their own cages.
And you have to keep that specific trait in mind because that psychological manipulation is going to be his primary weapon.
Which brings us to the trap that creates the mutiny. It is 1693. Every Chevalier is the first mate on a heavily armed privateer ship called the Charles II.
Right, part of the Spanish expedition shipping venture.
Yeah, an English venture. The mission sounds pretty straightforward. Sail to the West Indies, plunder French vessels under a legal letter of marque, and basically get rich.
It was a highly capitalized, state-sanctioned venture. Wealthy investors in London, led by a prominent merchant named Sir James Houblon, they promised the sailors guaranteed monthly wages, payable every 6 months.
Seems like a good deal.
On paper, yeah. The fleet sails out of the River Thames in August 1693, but they have to stop in Corunna, a port city in northern Spain, to acquire their final legal documents from the Spanish government before they actually cross the Atlantic.
And the bureaucracy just paralyzes them. They arrive in Corunna, and the paperwork simply isn't there. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months.
By May 1694, they have been anchored in this Spanish harbor for over half a year.
I really want to look at the physical and psychological toll of this. The ship is literally rotting beneath them. The hull is gathering barnacles. The provisions are spoiling. The stench of unwashed bodies confined to a damp wooden structure is inescapable.
And they haven't been paid a single shilling.
Nothing. The psychological torture of that uncertainty is immense. You are technically under contract, so you can't leave the ship without being branded a deserter.
Which is a crime punishable by hanging, by the way.
Right. So you can't leave, but the contract isn't being honored. Your families back in London are starving. They're petitioning the wealthy investors for the wages you were promised, and those petitions are being flatly ignored.
And that's when the paranoia really sets in. Rumors start sweeping through the lower decks that the English investors have bankrupted the expedition and secretly sold the crew into slavery to the Spanish.
Oh, wow. So they think they're destined for the galleys.
Exactly. They believe they are literally waiting to be enslaved.
Let me challenge the standard narrative here, though. The historical consensus often paints this mutiny as a spontaneous eruption of collective despair, like they just snapped. But looking at Every's history of calculated deception in the slave trade, isn't it more likely this was opportunistic greed?
I think so, yes.
I mean, he saw a rotting ship, a severely ill captain, and a desperate crew, and he actively engineered the mutiny rather than just getting swept up in it.
The evidence strongly supports you reading there. Every wasn't a victim of circumstance, he was a master of leveraging it. He recognized the exact breaking point of the crew.
Right.
He quietly went from ship to ship in the expedition. There were 4 ships in total, whispering in the dark, identifying the most desperate, capable men. He didn't promise them safety. He promised them agency. He promised to take them where they could get, quote, money enough.
So the mutiny triggers on May 7th, 1694, and it is a bloodless coup. The fleet's commander is actually sleeping ashore. It's 9 p.m. The password whispered through the dark is the drunken bosun on board?
Yeah.
About 25 conspirators rush the deck of the Charles II. The captain, Charles Gibson, is bedridden with a severe fever. Everyone walks into the captain's cabin, and he doesn't kill him.
No, he doesn't. According to the depositions of the men who were there, Every calmly explains that he is a, quote, man of fortune. He offers Captain Gibson a choice, join them as the ship's commander under the new regime, or be set ashore peacefully.
And Gibson refuses.
He does, and Every honors his word. He lowers a boat and allows Gibson and several loyalist sailors to just row away to safety.
We have to elevate this from a simple historical fact to a mental model of how illicit organizations survive. Every engineer's unanimous consent.
Right.
In a legal military structure, you can have dissenters because the law holds the structure together. But in an outlaw organization, the existence of a single dissenter introduces fatal risk.
Absolutely. If you keep a loyalist on board against their will, they will cut your throat in your sleep or sabotage the powder magazine.
Exactly. By letting the loyalists row away, Every ensured that his new crew was composed entirely of men who actively, enthusiastically chose the gallows over starvation.
It is a brilliant mechanism of control. They hold a democratic vote, elect Every as their captain, and immediately rename the ship the Fancy.
A symbolic rebirth.
Yeah. They slipped out of the harbor under the cover of darkness, exchange a few frantic cannon shots with a pursuing Spanish fort, and just vanish into the open ocean. They are no longer starving employees of a corrupt corporation. They are masters of their own destiny.
But they are also completely lawless. To survive the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the 17th century ocean, they can't just be a runaway merchant vessel. They need to become an apex predator.
Right, because the ocean dictates that survival relies on two things: speed and firepower.
And what they do to the Fancy to achieve this is, frankly, structurally terrifying. They sail down the coast of Africa and they resee the ship.
Reseeing is a drastic, highly dangerous engineering modification. While anchored off the coast of Africa, the crew literally takes saws and axes to their own floating home.
To their own ship.
Yeah, they physically cut away the upper decks, the forecastle and the aft castle. They remove the towering superstructure of the vessel.
Let's explain the physics of that for a second.
Yeah.
A typical 17th century merchant ship was built like a floating fortress.
Yeah.
Right? Very top-heavy, designed to repel boarders and carry massive amounts of cargo.
Exactly.
By chopping off those pop decks, you are stripping away tons of dead weight. You are lowering the ship's center of gravity and drastically reducing its wind drag.
Precisely. They transformed a lumbering cargo carrier into a hyper-fast, ghostly warship. Because it sat lower in the water and carried less weight, it caught the wind incredibly efficiently. The Fancy could outmaneuver and outrun almost anything on the water. It was a maritime scalpel, equipped with 36 heavy cannons.
And they immediately test their new weapon. They sail down the Guinea coast, entering Every's old stomping grounds. They hit the Cape Verde Islands, robbing 3 English ships.
Yeah, they trick local African chieftains into boarding under the guise of trade, steal their wealth, and enslave them. The brutality escalates rapidly.
It's a trail of terror designed to provision the ship, but more importantly, to recruit. Every time they capture a vessel, every crew persuades the most ambitious sailors to join them.
By the time they round the Cape of Good Hope and enter the Indian Ocean, the crew has swollen to 150 heavily armed, battle-hardened men.
They are building an army. And in early 1695, they stop at the Comoros Islands, specifically the island of Johanna. And Every does something that demonstrates a terrifying level of psychological sophistication. He sits down at his desk and writes a diplomatic letter.
Yeah, this part is incredible.
The letter is addressed to the English commanders of the East India Company's ships operating in the Indian Ocean. He explicitly claims that he has never wronged any English or Dutch ships and never intends to.
He even provides a special flag signal.
Right. He instructs them to hoist their ensign in a ball at the mizzen peak so he can identify them from a distance and leave them alone. And he signs it, an Englishman's friend.
We have to understand the vulnerability of the East India Company here. The company was not just a business. It was essentially a corporate nation-state. They had their own private armies, their own diplomats, and massive fleets of heavily armed merchantmen.
They were really the only force in the Indian Ocean capable of destroying the Fancy.
Exactly.
Every's letter is the equivalent of a serial killer taunting the police.
Yeah.
He knows the heavily armed EIC fleets are out there in the dark. He establishes his own twisted rules of engagement, basically gaslighting the entire British naval presence.
Yeah, he is essentially telling them, I make the rules out here. Fly your little flag, play my game, and I'll let you live.
He is isolating his true target by convincing the local police force to look the other way.
It is a calculated gamble to keep the big predators off his back while he sets his sights on the ultimate prey. With the EIC commanders confused and hesitant, Every sails for the Red Sea. Specifically, the volcanic island of Perim, located in the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb.
The geography here dictates the horror. The Straits of Bab el-Mandeb translates to the Gate of Tears.
Fitting.
Very. It is a brutal, unforgiving choke point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. You have black volcanic rock, suffocating heat, and dark, treacherous water. It is not open ocean, it is an alleyway. And everything is setting up an alleyway mugging.
It's August 1695. The word has spread through the maritime underground, and other pirate captains have actually converged on the same choke point. Every joins forces with 5 other pirate ships, including Thomas II on the Amity.
Wow.
And because of the sheer terrifying profile of the Reseed Fancy, Every is elected admiral of this pirate flotilla. He now commands 6 ships and over 440 desperate men.
They are hiding in the shadows of the volcanic islands, enduring the baking heat, waiting for the fleet of Emperor Aurangzeb, the ruler of the Mughal Empire. This fleet is returning from the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca.
But we must clarify, this is not just a passenger ferry.
No, not at all. The Hajj fleet carried the profits of extensive trade in the Middle East. It was a floating treasury of gold, silver, and jewels.
The tension of that ambush is difficult to overstate. You have 440 outlaws staring into the dark, waiting for a fleet that outguns them immensely. But the ocean is unpredictable. A massive storm hits, scattering the ships.
And in the chaos of the night, the vast majority of the Mughal fleet actually manages to slip past the pirates, completely undetected.
The pirates realize the treasure is sailing away toward India. A frantic chase begins. The slower pirate ships drop behind, but the Fancy, with its reduced drag, slices through the water.
Right.
They catch the trailing escort ship of the Mughal convoy, the Fateh Muhammad. They swarm it, overwhelm the defenders, and discover 50,000 pounds worth of treasure in the hold.
In 17th century terms, 50,000 pounds is an unfathomable sum. A common sailor earned maybe 12 pounds a year. They had just captured enough wealth to buy the Fancy 50 times over.
A rational crew would have divided the plunder, sailed to a safe port, and lived like minor nobility for the rest of their lives.
That is exactly what I was thinking when analyzing the navigational charts. Why not take the money and run? Why risk absolute annihilation against the flagship of the fleet when you already have a fortune?
Because Henry Everys was no longer operating on rational self-preservation. This is the intoxicating nature of greed. He looks at that 50,000 pounds and it doesn't satisfy him. It confirms his intelligence. If the escort ship holds a fortune, what does the Leviathan ahead hold? He has crossed a psychological point of no return. The adrenaline of the chase pushes them past logic.
So they leave the Fateh Muhammad behind and lock their sights on the Ganj-i-Sawai. And I want to spend significant time on the mechanics of this encounter because it is not a swashbuckling adventure. It is a descent into absolute terror. The Ganj-i-Sawai is 1,600 tons. It mounts 80 heavy cannons. It carries a musket-armed guard of 400 highly trained soldiers, plus 600 passengers. The Fancy is a fraction of its size, with 46 guns.
By all conventional military logic, this should have been a slaughter of the pirates.
It's like a pack of dirt bikes trying to hijack an armored train. The Fancy does not have the mass to survive a direct broadside from an 80-gun galleon. Its survival depends entirely on maneuverability, dodging the main guns of the train, and finding a weak point.
Right.
The battle begins over the open water. The deafening roar of cannon fire. The air fills with thick, sulfurous white smoke, reducing visibility to a few feet.
And then two catastrophic anomalies occur in rapid succession. First, a pirate cannonball strikes the Ganj-i-Sawai's mainmast.
We need to understand the physics of a wooden mast failing. It doesn't just snap cleanly.
No, not at all. A 17th century mainmast is a massive, towering trunk of solid timber supporting tons of canvas and heavy rigging. When a solid iron cannonball shatters it at the base, the tension releases violently. The mast collapses onto the deck, bringing down a labyrinth of heavy ropes, wooden blocks, and sails, instantly crushing men beneath it.
The Mughal behemoth is paralyzed. It loses its wind propulsion and its ability to steer. It becomes a sitting duck in the water. And then the internal defense mechanism fails.
Yeah. The Mughal gunners are returning fire. They ignite one of their largest cannons, but the iron casing of the gun has a microfracture, or maybe it was double loaded with powder in the panic. The massive cannon explodes on their own deck.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
In naval combat, the iron cannonball fired at the enemy is only half the threat, right? The real danger is shrapnel.
Exactly. When that cannon ruptures, it sends jagged shards of hot iron and massive splinters of deckwood flying at the speed of sound through the tightly packed ranks of the Mughal gunners. It instantly kills dozens of defenders and creates a localized epicenter of panic and gore on the deck.
The defensive line is broken from within. The Fancy pulls alongside, utilizing its speed to avoid the remaining functional cannons. The pirates throw grappling hooks, locking the two ships together.
And now, imagine the sheer horror of this moment for the passengers. You are on a paralyzed ship. The deck is covered in blood and screaming men, and swarming up the wooden sides of your vessel, climbing through the smoke, are 150 hardened killers.
And here we see the stark contrast in command. We discussed Every's absolute cold control over his men. On the Mughal side, the captain of the Ganj-i-Sawai, Muhammad Ibrahim, entirely breaks down.
Yeah, the contemporary accounts from the Indian historian Kafi Khan are unflinching here. Captain Ibrahim, commanding 400 armed musketeers who could have easily repelled the boarding party with a coordinated volley, panics. He drops his command, flees below deck, and hides.
It's unbelievable. Kafi Khan writes with absolute disgust that Ibrahim actually armed the enslaved girls on the ship and sent them up the ladders to fight the pirates while he cowered in the hold.
It is the ultimate betrayal of duty. Because the leadership evaporates, the massive numerical advantage of the Mughal soldiers turns into leaderless chaos. The pirates swarm over the rails. The fighting is fierce, brutal hand-to-hand combat with cutlasses and boarding axes, but without coordinated musket fire to stop them, the pirates slaughter their way across the deck and take the ship.
And this is where the romance of piracy completely dies. Once the ship is secured, the survivors are entirely at the mercy of outlaws operating in a void where their darkest, most sadistic impulses are completely unchecked.
Yeah. Kafi Khan's records detail a prolonged ordeal that lasted for several days. The pirates didn't just grab the gold and leave. They engaged in unmitigated physical and psychological torture.
For days.
For days. They brutally beat the passengers and the crew, forcing them to reveal where the remaining wealth was hidden in the cavernous holds of the ship.
The human tragedy is unbearable. The women on board, many returning from a sacred religious pilgrimage, were subjected to horrific sexual assaults. Kafi Khan writes that the psychological terror was so absolute that several women, upon seeing what was happening, literally ran to the rails and threw themselves into the open ocean to drown.
Others used hidden daggers to take their own lives rather than face the brutality of Evry's men.
It forces us to look directly at the reality of lawlessness. When the veneer of civilization is removed, humanity is capable of unspeakable darkness.
And the reward for this barbarism was the largest single heist in the history of the world. They pull out sacks of gold, Arabian silver, and unpolished diamonds. The estimates range between 200,000 and 600,000 pounds.
In today's currency, you are looking at roughly a $125 million haul.
Wow.
Every single pirate on the Fancy, down to the lowest deckhand who was starving in Corunna a year prior, suddenly possesses a fortune that rivals the wealth of the English aristocracy.
But wealth at that magnitude, extracted with that level of violence from an empire as powerful as the Mughals, creates a geopolitical shockwave.
That has to.
The pirates eventually abandon the blood-stained Ganj-i-Sawai and sail away into the vastness of the ocean. The shattered vessel limps into Surat. The traumatized survivors stumble ashore, and the news reaches the ear of Emperor Aurangzeb.
Aurangzeb was arguably the most powerful monarch on the planet. His empire controlled vast swaths of the global economy. He didn't just view this attack as a theft, he viewed the assault on the Hajj pilgrims as an unforgivable sacrilege, and the survivors confirmed that the attackers were English.
Aurangzeb's wrath was immediate and absolute. He directed the full force of the Mughal Empire against the English East India Company. He ordered his armies to besiege the company's factories in India.
Let's clarify what a factory was in the 17th century, because we aren't talking about industrial smokestacks. These were massive, fortified colonial trading posts, essentially castles filled with warehouses of spices, textiles, and silk. They were the absolute lifelines of British wealth.
Exactly. Aurangzeb's armies surround these fortresses, they seize the assets, they imprison the East India Company executives and officers, placing them in irons.
Just lock them up.
Yeah. The trade routes to India, which supply the crucial imports that keep the British Empire functioning, are slammed shut. One rogue pirate ship has effectively triggered a trade war that threatens to bankrupt the entire English nation.
The panic in London is palpable. The East India Company essentially tells the English Parliament, if you do not catch this man, our economy will collapse. Parliament immediately issues a proclamation declaring Henry Every and his crew hostis humani generis, enemies of the human race.
That legal distinction is profound. It strips the crew of the Fancy of all legal rights. It means they exist entirely outside the protection of any law, and any navy, any merchant, any citizen of any nation on earth has the right to hunt them down and kill them.
The Board of Trade initiates the first global manhunt in recorded history. The English government puts a massive bounty of £500 on Every's head. The East India Company, desperate to reopen their trade routes, matches it. A £1,000 bounty.
Which is astronomical.
Let's put that in perspective. If a skilled laborer worked for 60 years, they might earn £1,000. It is lottery money for turning in a ghost. Proclamations are shipped across the Atlantic, to every colony, every port, every naval vessel.
The psychological whiplash for the crew of the Fancy must have been staggering.
You are carrying heavy, clinking foreign silver. You have more wealth than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. But simultaneously, you realize that the entire world is actively hunting you.
Yeah, you can't walk into a tavern and pay with an Arabian gold coin without the barkeep realizing exactly who you are and knowing you can get rich by slitting your throat in your sleep.
There is nowhere safe to dock, nowhere safe to sleep. The vast ocean suddenly feels incredibly claustrophobic.
Hunted by the world, the fancy must find a sanctuary. They can't sail to Europe. India is a death sentence. They make a desperate play for the edge of the known English world. The underpopulated, desperate, and notoriously corrupt island of New Providence in the Bahamas.
They arrive off the coast of the Bahamas in early 1696. Everydex assumes an alias, Captain Bridgman. He angers the massive, terrifying fancy off the coast and sends a letter ashore to the colonial governor, Nicholas Trott. He offers him a devil's bargain.
Governor Trott is highly vulnerable at this point. The 9 Years' War is still raging, the French are a constant threat to the islands, and New Providence is woefully underdefended.
Right.
Suddenly, this hyper-fast warship with over 100 heavily armed men appears in his harbor. Every claims they are simply unlicensed interlopers, illegal traders looking for shore leave.
But the bribe he offers is impossible to ignore. Everyvow offers Trott nearly 900 pounds in cash, which is triple the governor's annual salary. He unloads 50 tons of ivory tusks, 100 barrels of gunpowder, chests of firearms, and the ultimate prize, he gives the fancy itself to the governor.
Trott accepts. He rationalizes it to his council by arguing that the fancy will bolster the island's defenses against the French, conveniently omitting the massive private bribe, of course.
Right, of course.
The pirates finally step ashore, but the Bahamas in 1696 is barely a settlement. It's a few wooden shacks and taverns. There is no infrastructure to launder their millions. The money is useless.
And what happens to the fancy, the ship that terrified the Indian Ocean, the vessel that shattered the Mughal flagship? It meets an eerie, violent end. Governor Trott strips it of everything valuable, and then the ship is violently driven against the jagged rocks in the harbor.
Whether a sudden storm caused it, or if Trott deliberately ordered it destroyed to eliminate the most glaring piece of evidence of his corruption, remains debated.
But the visual is haunting. The shattered hull of the Charles II, reborn as the predatory fancy, left to rot in the Bahamian surf. A ghostly end to a nightmare machine.
The destruction of the ship is the final wake-up call for the crew. Word arrives in the Caribbean that the Royal Navy knows they are in the Americas. The 1,000-pound bounty is active. The crew realizes Governor Trott cannot protect them from the wrath of the British Empire.
The paranoia shatters the crew.
They scatter to the winds. The terror of being a fugitive sets in. Some flee up the coast to the North American colonies. They arrive in Pennsylvania, where they bribe the notoriously corrupt Governor William Markham to let them stay.
But the net tightens. Some pirates decide the colonies are too hot and try to sneak back into the British Isles. And this is where the reality of their crime catches up to them. You cannot hide an empire's stolen wealth in a quiet English village.
You really can't. We can trace this through John Dan, Every's coxswain. Dan manages to sail back to England and books a room at an inn in Rochester, Kent. He makes a fatal, careless mistake. He leaves his waistcoat in his room. The chambermaid comes in to clean, picks up the coat, and realizes it is incredibly heavy. She tears the lining and discovers over 1,000 pounds in gold sequins and guineas stitched into the fabric.
She immediately reports him to the local magistrate. Dan is arrested, and facing the gallows, he completely breaks. He turns King's evidence and starts giving up the names and locations of his former crewmates. Goldsmiths and jewelers across England start reporting men who walk in off the street trying to exchange unpolished diamonds and exotic Arabian coins.
Slowly, methodically, 24 of Every's men are captured. The ensuing trials at the Old Bailey in London are a chilling display of state power. The government is under immense pressure from the East India Company to secure convictions to appease Aurangzeb.
Right.
The first jury, perhaps harboring working-class sympathy for men who mutinied against a corrupt corporation, actually acquits them.
The judges are absolutely furious. They cannot let these men go or the economy will collapse. They rush through a second indictment, stack the jury, and aggressively threaten them, explicitly stating that a not guilty verdict will destroy the English trade in India.
The second jury finds them guilty.
In November 1696, the condemned men are taken to execution dock in Wapping. They are paraded before a massive crowd of Londoners. They are forced to give solemn, dying speeches facing the River Thames.
The exact same river they sailed down 3 years earlier when this nightmare began.
And then The floor drops. They swing by the Thames, their bodies left hanging in chains as a rotting warning to the maritime world.
But while his men choked on the gallows, the mastermind, the pirate king himself, completely evaporated.
This is the ultimate lingering horror of the story. How does the most wanted man on Earth, with a face known to hundreds, a historic bounty on his head, and pockets bulging with diamonds, disappear without a single trace?
For centuries, the public accepted a narrative popularized by a writer named Captain Charles Johnson in his 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates. Johnson claimed that Everyway sneaked back to his home county of Devon. He tried to secretly fence his diamonds to local merchants.
Okay.
But the merchants realized he was a fugitive, blackmailed him, took the diamonds, and gave him nothing. According to this legend, the Pirate King died a penniless, broken, starving beggar, unable to afford his own coffin.
But when you examine that critically, it sounds like pure propaganda. Crime doesn't pay. Look at the boogeyman. He died in the gutter. If he was living in absolute starving poverty, wouldn't someone have turned him in for the £1,000 reward?
Exactly.
Why wouldn't the merchants just turn him in after robbing him to get the bounty as well? It doesn't hold up.
Modern historians are highly skeptical of the poverty legend, which brings us to an incredible discovery made in 2024. Two shipwreck explorers, Sean Kingsley and Rex Cowan, were digging through the Scottish archives when they uncovered a misfiled document.
This is where it gets crazy.
It was a highly sophisticated coded letter utilizing complex cryptographic substitutions. It was dated December 1700, 4 years after Avery supposedly vanished.
And it is signed Avery the Pirate.
The implications of this document are staggering. The researchers managed to connect the drop address on the letter to King William III's early intelligence network, his spy ring.
Let's follow this thread. Are we theorizing that the man who broke international law, tortured innocent pilgrims, and nearly destroyed the British economy, evaded the gallows because the king secretly hired him as a state intelligence asset?
It is a profoundly unsettling theory, but historically it possesses a dark strategic logic. Publicly, the English government absolutely had to hang Avery's crew to appease the Mughal Emperor and save the East India Company. But privately, Henry Avery possessed incredibly valuable assets.
Can do everything.
He had intimate knowledge of global shipping routes, the navigational hazards of the Red Sea, the locations of pirate safe havens in Madagascar and the Caribbean, and he possessed vast, untraceable wealth. We've already established he was a master of psychological manipulation and false flags. Who better to operate in the shadows for the crown?
The researchers link him to figures like Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, who was known to be a pioneering intelligence agent for the government. Defoe was actually operating in Cornwall under an alias around the exact time the coded letter instructed replies to be sent to Cornwall.
Wow.
But I have to push back here. In an era of intense espionage, isn't it entirely possible the letter is a forgery, a clever piece of 18th century identity theft, like a spy using the name of the ultimate boogeyman to throw investigators off the scent?
We must concede that it is entirely possible. The cipher hasn't been completely broken, and the historical record of espionage is designed to be fragmented. The mystery remains officially unresolved. But that ambiguity only deepens the psychological dread. The idea that a monster of this magnitude didn't face justice, didn't die in poverty, but instead traded his stolen wealth for a quiet life of state-sponsored espionage, it means the predator simply walked away into the fog.
It is a terrifying thought. If we look at the final tally of Henry Avery's legacy, he was only a pirate captain for about 2 years. But in that brief window, he broke the world order. He unleashed unfathomable suffering on the innocent passengers of the Ganj-i-Sawai. He sparked the first global manhunt. He forced the militarization of the merchant fleets, forever changing maritime security.
He wrote the operational playbook for the golden age of piracy, using speed, psychological terror, and extreme violence to overwhelm larger targets. Men like Blackbeard were children when Avery pulled off his heist. They grew up in a world altered by his actions.
He stripped away the romantic veneer of the ocean and revealed the raw, desperate, brutal reality of survival and unchecked greed.
Which is why these maritime horror stories continue to grip us. Out there on the dark water, society's rules mean absolutely nothing.
The story of the Ganj-i-Sawai forces us to confront the absolute darkness that humans are capable of when they believe they are beyond the reach of the law, when they believe the isolation of the ocean will swallow their sins.
And the ocean keeps its secrets well. The fancy rotting in the surf, the treasure dispersed, the captain vanished.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a chilling final thought to mull over. Think about the sheer volume of wealth, Henry says. Every extracted from that ship, the 600,000 pounds, the gold, the Arabian silver, the sacks of unpolished diamonds.
It's an unimaginable sum.
If the poverty legend is indeed a lie, if he didn't die in the gutter in Devon, and if that 2024 espionage theory is correct, and he truly integrated back into English high society as a phantom spy shielded by the crown.
Then that massive injection of wealth didn't just vanish, it entered the economy. It became structural.
Exactly. It means that somewhere in the bloodlines of the 18th century English aristocracy, there were grand estates built, political campaigns heavily funded, and prestigious legacies established entirely on the stolen jewels and the terrified screams of the passengers of the Ganj-i-Sawai. How much of our civilized world was quietly, secretly funded by the very monsters we supposedly hunted? Henry didn't just escape the gallows. He bought a seat at the table, turned up the lights, and let his victims sink into the dark.